The coffee cup slipped from my hands and shattered across our kitchen floor, sending ceramic shards and hot liquid everywhere. But I barely noticed the mess because my eyes were locked on the small piece of paper I'd just pulled from Mike's jacket pocket. A receipt that would unravel 10 years of marriage in less than 60 seconds. It wasn't what was on the receipt that destroyed me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was what wasn't on it. The date showed last Tuesday, the night Mike claimed he was stuck at the office until midnight, dealing with an insurance claim emergency. But this receipt was time-stamped 11:47 p.m. from Mercy General Hospital's emergency department. Not as a patient, as a visitor. Someone had been rushed to the hospital that night, and my husband had been there with them while I sat at home worrying why he wasn't answering his phone. The worst part? The receipt was crumpled and worn, like he'd been carrying it around for days, pulling it out and staring at it, maybe trying to decide whether to tell me the truth. Instead, he chose to keep lying. He chose to let me believe his story about difficult clients and overtime reports, while he dealt with whatever crisis had taken him to that hospital in the middle of the night. Standing there surrounded by broken ceramic and spilled coffee, I realized that receipt wasn't just proof of one lie. It was evidence of a pattern I'd been too blind to see, too trusting to question, and too comfortable to confront. My husband had been living a double life, and I was about to discover just how deep his deception went. Mike Sullivan had always been the kind of man who remembered anniversaries, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and coached Emma's soccer team every Saturday morning without complaint. When we met 13 years ago at a charity fundraiser in downtown Riverside, he was the guy who stayed after the event ended to help stack chairs and clean up, not because anyone asked him to, but because that's who he was. Or at least, that's who I thought he was. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. 3 years of steady, reliable courtship that felt like the opposite of the dramatic, unstable relationships I'd watched my friends cycle through. Mike was predictable in the best possible way. He called when he said he would, showed up on time for every date, and never played the kind of emotional games that left you wondering where you stood. He was safe, which felt revolutionary after years of dating men who treated relationships like competitive sports. Our wedding was exactly what we'd both wanted. Small, intimate, focused on family rather than spectacle. We honeymooned in San Diego, spending a week walking beaches and visiting museums, talking about the house we'd buy and the children we'd raise, and the quiet, happy life we'd build together. Mike wanted 2 kids, maybe 3. I wanted a garden and a dog, and Sunday morning pancakes that became family tradition. We both wanted the kind of marriage our grandparents had. Steady, committed, built to last. Emma arrived 2 years later, a beautiful baby who inherited Mike's calm temperament and my stubborn determination to do everything herself. Mike was a natural father from day one, getting up for midnight feedings without being asked, learning to braid hair for school picture days, turning ordinary Tuesday evenings into dance parties in our living room. Watching him with our daughter, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. We bought the house on Maple Street when Emma was 4. A modest 3-bedroom ranch with a big backyard and enough space for the family we planned to expand. Mike handled the mortgage negotiations while I managed the moving logistics, both of us falling naturally into the roles that suited our strengths. He was practical and detail-oriented. I was organized and forward-thinking. Together, we made decisions easily and rarely disagreed about major issues. For 8 years, our life unfolded exactly as we'd planned. Mike built his insurance business steadily, earning the trust of clients who appreciated his honesty and attention to detail. I advanced from junior accountant to senior associate at Miller & Associates, managing increasingly complex client portfolios and earning respect from colleagues who valued my thoroughness. Emma thrived in school, made friends easily, and showed promise as both a student and an athlete. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We weren't passionate anymore, but we were deeply connected. We weren't adventurous, but we were content with the routines and traditions we'd established. Our marriage was the kind that looked boring from the outside, but felt secure and satisfying from within. We were partners in every sense of the word, building something together that felt permanent and unshakable. The first sign that something was changing came about 8 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as a warning at the time. Mike started working longer hours, staying at the office until 7 or 8 o'clock instead of his usual 5:30. He explained that his agency was expanding, taking on new commercial accounts that required more complex paperwork and client meetings. The extra income would help us save for Emma's college fund and maybe take that family trip to Europe we'd been discussing for years. I was proud of his success and supportive of his ambition. Mike had always been hardworking, but he'd also been careful to maintain work-life balance for Emma's sake. If he was willing to put in extra hours now, it meant he was thinking strategically about our family's future. The fact that his increased dedication coincided with Emma reaching an age where she needed less constant supervision seemed perfectly logical. The longer hours gradually became longer days. Mike started traveling occasionally for work, overnight trips to Los Angeles or San Francisco to meet with regional managers or attend training seminars. These trips were always well documented. He'd show me confirmation emails, discuss the agenda, and call every evening to talk with Emma and me. There was nothing suspicious about legitimate business travel, especially for someone building a successful insurance practice. But other changes were harder to explain away. Mike became increasingly protective of his phone, keeping it face down during dinner and taking calls in the garage or his home office, rather than in the living room where we used to share space comfortably. When I asked about the secrecy, he'd laugh and explain that insurance discussions were boring, and he didn't want to subject us to talk about liability coverage and premium calculations. He also started paying more attention to his appearance in ways that seemed unrelated to professional advancement. Mike had always been neat and well-groomed, but suddenly he was buying expensive cologne, upgrading his wardrobe, and spending time at the gym he'd largely ignored for years. When I complimented his new look, he'd shrug and say he was just trying to stay healthy and professional as his client base expanded. The most troubling change was how Mike began encouraging me to develop interests and friendships outside our family. He'd suggest I plan girls' weekends with Rachel, take evening classes at the community college, or join professional organizations that met on weeknight when he was working late. His encouragement felt generous and supportive, but it also felt like he was trying to keep me busy and distracted. When I mentioned these observations to Rachel during one of our monthly coffee dates, she listened with the kind of careful attention that suggested she'd been waiting for me to notice what she'd already seen. Rachel had been my closest friend since college, the maid of honor at my wedding, and Emma's unofficial aunt. She knew Mike almost as well as I did, which is why her next question hit so hard. "Sarah, when was the last time you and Mike had a real conversation about something other than Emma's schedule or household logistics?" she asked gently. "When was the last time he told you something personal? Something about his thoughts or feelings or dreams?" I started to answer, then realized I couldn't remember. Our conversations had become purely functional over the past several months, focused on carpools and grocery lists and weekend plans. We still talked every day, but we weren't really communicating about anything meaningful. I'd assumed this was normal for couples with demanding careers and an active child, but Rachel's question made me wonder if something more significant was happening. That night, I tried to engage Mike in the kind of deeper conversation we used to have regularly. I asked about his goals for the business, his thoughts about Emma's development, his feelings about our plans for the future. His responses were polite but superficial, like he was speaking to an acquaintance rather than his wife. When I pushed for more personal sharing, he became uncomfortable and redirected the conversation back to safer topics. The distance between us wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual and subtle, like a tide slowly receding until you realize the beach looks completely different than it did that morning. Mike was still physically present, still reliable about practical matters, still affectionate with Emma, but emotionally he'd moved somewhere I couldn't reach, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had opened between us. I started paying closer attention to Mike's patterns and behaviors, not because I suspected anything specific, but because I was trying to understand what had changed in our relationship. That's when I noticed the Tuesday night pattern. Almost every week, Mike would work late on Tuesday, usually until 9 or 10 o'clock. These late nights always involved the same explanation: complex commercial accounts that required extra attention or client meetings that couldn't be scheduled during regular business hours. The Tuesday pattern bothered me because it was so consistent. In 10 years of marriage, Mike had never had such regular overtime obligations. His work had always been variable, with busy periods balanced by lighter weeks. But now, Tuesday nights were blocked out like standing appointments. and the explanations for them were becoming increasingly vague. I decided to surprise Mike one Tuesday evening by bringing dinner to his office, thinking we could eat together during his break and Emma could see where her father worked so hard. When I arrived at his building at 7:30, the parking lot was nearly empty, and Mike's car was nowhere to be seen. The security guard told me that most of the office workers had left hours ago, and he hadn't seen anyone from Mike's floor since late afternoon. Standing in that empty parking lot, holding takeout containers from Mike's favorite restaurant, I felt the first real stab of fear about what was happening in my marriage. Mike wasn't where he claimed to be, which meant he was lying to me about something significant. The question was whether he was lying to hide something harmful or to protect something private, and I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. I drove home that night with my mind racing through explanations that ranged from innocent to devastating. Maybe Mike was planning a surprise for my upcoming birthday and needed to meet with party planners or jewelry store employees after hours. Maybe he was dealing with a family member's crisis that he didn't want to worry me with until he had more information. Maybe he was seeing a therapist or counselor to work through personal issues he wasn't ready to share. But maybe he was having an affair. Maybe he'd fallen in love with someone else and was using Tuesday nights to build a relationship that had nothing to do with our family. Maybe all the changes I'd noticed, the improved appearance, the phone secrecy, the emotional distance, were signs of a man who'd found what he was looking for somewhere else. When Mike came home at 9:45 that night, I was waiting in the kitchen with Emma's homework spread across the table, trying to look casual and normal. He kissed the top of my head, asked about our day, and mentioned that his client meeting had run longer than expected. The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others I'd accepted without question over the past few months. I didn't confront him that night because I wasn't sure what I was confronting him about. One instance of being somewhere other than where he claimed could have an innocent explanation. But it planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger every time Mike mentioned working late, traveling for business, or taking phone calls in private. Over the next few weeks, I found myself becoming a detective in my own marriage, paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. I noticed that Mike's business trips never generated the usual paper trail of receipts, itineraries, or conference materials. I observed that his client meetings never resulted in follow-up calls or discussions about new accounts. I realized that his overtime work never produced the kind of stress or fatigue that typically accompanied long hours. The most telling discovery came when I decided to look through our credit card statements more carefully. Mike had always handled our finances responsibly, and I trusted him to manage our accounts without much oversight. But when I started examining the monthly charges in detail, I found a pattern of expenses that didn't match Mike's explanations of his activities. There were regular charges at restaurants I'd never been to, always on Tuesday evenings, and always for amounts that suggested two people rather than business meals. There were purchases at stores I didn't recognize, clothing retailers and specialty shops that didn't fit with Mike's usual practical shopping habits. Most concerning were charges for services I couldn't identify, medical appointments at facilities I'd never heard of, consultation fees for professionals whose specialties weren't clear from the billing descriptions. I spent an entire Saturday afternoon while Mike and Emma were at soccer practice, going through 6 months of financial records and creating a timeline of unexplained expenses. The pattern was undeniable. Mike was spending significant amounts of money on activities he wasn't sharing with me, and those activities required enough secrecy that he was willing to lie repeatedly to hide them. That night, after Emma was asleep and Mike was watching television in the living room, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I was going to ask him directly about the discrepancies I'd discovered. I was going to give him the opportunity to explain what was happening and to tell me the truth about where he'd been spending his time and our money. But before I could work up the courage to start that conversation, Mike's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID, apologized, and stepped into the garage to take the call. Through the kitchen window, I could see him pacing back and forth, talking animatedly to someone who clearly knew him well. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and when Mike returned, he looked shaken in a way I hadn't seen since his father's heart attack 3 years ago. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual rather than suspicious. "Just work stuff," Mike replied, but his voice carried a tension that suggested otherwise. "I might need to make some changes to my schedule over the next few weeks." That was the moment I realized our marriage had reached a crossroads. Mike was dealing with something serious enough to disrupt his routine, but he wasn't willing to share what that something was. I could continue pretending I hadn't noticed the lies and inconsistencies, or I could demand the truth about what was really happening in our family. The next morning, while Mike was in the shower and Emma was eating breakfast, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to follow Mike on his next Tuesday evening adventure. I was going to see for myself where he went and what he did during those mysterious late nights that required so much secrecy. I had no experience with surveillance or investigation, but I was desperate for answers that Mike seemed unwilling to provide. If he was having an affair, I needed to know so I could make informed decisions about our marriage and Emma's future. If he was dealing with some other kind of crisis, I needed to understand what we were facing as a family. Either way, I was done being the trusting wife who accepted explanations without question. It was time to discover who my husband really was, and what our marriage had actually become. That Tuesday, I arranged for Emma to spend the evening with Rachel, telling my best friend that I had important errands to run and would pick up my daughter by 9. Rachel didn't ask questions, but the look she gave me suggested she understood exactly what kind of errands required leaving your child with a babysitter on a school night. At 6:30, I positioned myself in the parking lot of a grocery store across from Mike's office building, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. At 7:15, Mike's car emerged from the underground garage and turned toward a part of town I rarely visited. Following someone without being detected turned out to be harder than it looked in movies. I had to stay far enough back to avoid recognition, while staying close enough to see where he was going. Mike drove with the confidence of someone following a familiar route, making turns and lane changes that suggested he'd made this trip many times before. After 20 minutes, Mike pulled into the parking lot of a medical complex I'd never seen before. It was a large, modern building with multiple specialty offices and what appeared to be an outpatient treatment facility. Mike walked inside carrying the same overnight bag I'd seen him pack for business trips, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He didn't emerge for over 2 hours. When he finally came out, the overnight bag was gone, but he was carrying what looked like prescription medications and a folder of papers. He sat in his car for several minutes, making phone calls that seemed emotional based on his body language and facial expressions. From there, Mike drove to an upscale restaurant in downtown Riverside, the same place where our credit card had been charged repeatedly on Tuesday evenings. This was where my amateur surveillance skills failed me completely. I couldn't follow him inside without risking exposure, and I couldn't see through the restaurant's windows from the parking lot. I sat in my car for 90 minutes, watching other diners come and go, wondering if Mike was inside with another woman, or if there was some other explanation for his weekly routine. The uncertainty was almost worse than catching him with someone else would have been, because at least infidelity would have been a clear betrayal with obvious consequences. When Mike finally emerged from the restaurant, he was alone but looked lighter somehow, like someone who'd accomplished something difficult but worthwhile. He spent several minutes in his car, typing messages on his phone with the kind of focused attention that suggested important communications. The drive home took 15 minutes, and Mike arrived only 20 minutes before I did. By the time I picked up Emma from Rachel's and returned to Maple Street, he was already in his pajamas, reading a book in bed and asking about my day with the same casual interest he'd shown for years. If I hadn't spent the evening following him around town, I would have believed his story about working late completely. Mike's ability to transition seamlessly from his secret Tuesday night activities to normal husband and father behavior was either evidence of compartmentalization skills I'd never suspected, or proof that whatever he was hiding had become so routine that lying about it required no emotional effort. That night, lying in bed next to him, I realized that discovering the location of Mike's Tuesday nights had only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The medical complex, the restaurant meetings, the overnight bag, the prescription medications, none of it suggested a typical affair, but all of it suggested deception on a scale that went far beyond working late occasionally. I had evidence that my husband was lying to me systematically, but I still didn't know what he was lying about or why the truth required such elaborate secrecy. The not knowing was destroying my peace of mind and my ability to function normally in our marriage. I needed answers, and it was becoming clear that Mike wasn't going to volunteer them willingly. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. After Mike left for his job and Emma left for school, I drove back to the medical complex and spent an hour studying the directory of doctors and specialists in the lobby. The building housed everything from cardiologists to psychiatrists to addiction counselors to fertility specialists. Reading through the list of medical specialties, I realized that any one of them could explain Mike's secrecy if he was dealing with a diagnosis he wasn't ready to share. Men often hid health problems from their families, either out of denial or a misguided desire to protect their loved ones from worry. Mike could be battling anything from heart disease to depression to addiction issues that required regular treatment and monitoring. But the overnight bag and restaurant meetings suggested something more complex than routine medical care. Recovery programs, support groups, and counseling relationships often involved social components and accountability partnerships that might require evening meetings and progress celebrations. Mike could be dealing with addiction, mental health issues, or behavioral problems that necessitated comprehensive treatment involving multiple professionals and peer support systems. The possibility that my husband was struggling with serious personal issues while hiding his pain from me felt both heartbreaking and infuriating. Heartbreaking because he was suffering alone when he could have had my support and understanding. Infuriating because he'd made unilateral decisions about our marriage and family without giving me the opportunity to help or even to know what we were facing together. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 10 years of marriage. I searched Mike's home office thoroughly, looking for any evidence that might explain his Tuesday night routine and his increasing secrecy. I felt guilty about violating his privacy, but I felt more anxious about continuing to live with lies and uncertainty. What I found in his desk drawer would change everything I thought I knew about my husband, and force me to confront truths about our marriage that I'd been too blind or too trusting to see. Hidden beneath insurance forms and client files was a notebook filled with dates, times, and cryptic notes that revealed a pattern of deception far more extensive than Tuesday night disappearances. But more than that, I found evidence of a secret that would explain not just where Mike had been going, but why our marriage had been slowly dissolving while I remained completely unaware of the forces destroying it from within. The library became my second office over the next 2 weeks. Every morning after dropping Emma at school, I'd park in the same spot near the reference section and spend 3 hours learning about surveillance, financial investigations, and divorce law. I felt like I was studying for the most important test of my life, except this test would determine whether my marriage survived or whether I'd be raising Emma as a single mother. I discovered that California was a no-fault divorce state, which meant I wouldn't need to prove Mike was cheating to end our marriage. But I also learned that evidence of infidelity could affect custody arrangements and spousal support, especially if marital assets had been used to fund an affair. Every piece of information felt both empowering and terrifying, like I was building a case against the father of my child. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy at home. Mike continued his Tuesday night disappearances with clockwork precision, always with plausible work-related excuses. He'd started branching out to occasional Thursday evenings, too, claiming new client presentations and regional meetings that required him to stay late. Each lie felt like a small betrayal, but I'd learned to nod sympathetically and wish him luck with his demanding schedule. Emma noticed the tension before I realized I was showing it. One evening, while I was helping her with homework, she looked up from her math worksheet and asked if Daddy and I were fighting. The question caught me off guard, because Mike and I weren't fighting at all. We were being polite, considerate, and distant with each other, like roommates who happened to share a child and a mortgage. I assured Emma that everything was fine, but her innocent question made me realize how much our family dynamic had shifted. Mike and I rarely touched anymore, rarely had conversations that went beyond logistics and schedules. We were performing the roles of husband and wife rather than actually being married, and our 8-year-old daughter could sense the difference, even if she couldn't articulate it. That night, I made a decision that felt both brave and foolish. I was going to follow Mike on his next Tuesday evening adventure. I'd never done anything remotely like surveillance before, but I'd watched enough detective shows to understand the basics. Stay far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to see where he went and what he did. Tuesday arrived with unusual California rain, the kind of steady drizzle that made everything look gray and depressing. Mike left work at his regular time, texting me that he'd be staying late for quarterly reviews. I arranged for Emma to have dinner and homework help at Rachel's house, telling my best friend that I had an important errand to run and would pick Emma up by 9. Rachel didn't ask questions, but the look she gave me suggested she knew exactly what kind of errand required leaving my daughter with a babysitter on a school night. She just hugged me and told me to be careful, words that felt heavier than they should have. I positioned myself in the parking lot of a coffee shop across from Mike's building at 6:30, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. At 7:15, Mike's silver Honda emerged from the underground garage and turned left toward downtown. I followed at what I hoped was a safe distance, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mike drove with the confidence of someone following a familiar route. He didn't check his mirrors excessively or take unexpected turns that might indicate he suspected surveillance. After 15 minutes, he pulled into the parking lot of a medical complex I'd never seen before, a modern building with multiple specialty offices and a pharmacy on the ground floor. I parked behind a large SUV that provided cover while still allowing me to see the building entrance. Mike walked inside carrying a small overnight bag I'd never seen before, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He didn't emerge for over an hour. When he finally came out, the overnight bag was gone, but he was carrying what looked like prescription medications and a folder of papers. He sat in his car for several minutes, making phone calls that seemed intense based on his hand gestures and facial expressions. Then he drove to a nearby restaurant, the same upscale place where our credit card had been charged repeatedly on Tuesday evenings. This was where my amateur surveillance skills failed me. I couldn't follow him inside without risking exposure, and I couldn't see through the restaurant's tinted windows from the parking lot. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching other couples come and go, wondering if Mike was inside with another woman or if there was some other explanation for his mysterious routine. The most frustrating part was how normal everything looked from the outside. Mike wasn't acting like a man having a clandestine affair. He wasn't looking over his shoulder or acting nervous. He was behaving like someone running routine errands. Except these errands required lies and secrecy and explanations that didn't add up. When Mike finally emerged from the restaurant, he was alone, but looked happier than I'd seen him in months. He was smiling at his phone, typing messages with the kind of enthusiasm he used to show when texting me during our early dating days. Watching him from across a dark parking lot, I felt like I was looking at a stranger who happened to share my husband's face. Mike drove straight home after that, arriving only 20 minutes before I did. By the time I picked up Emma from Rachel's and returned to Maple Street, he was already in his pajamas, watching the news and asking about my day with the same casual interest he'd shown for years. If I hadn't spent the evening following him around town, I would have believed his story about working late completely. That night, lying in bed next to him, I realized that discovering the truth about Mike's secret life was only half the battle. The other half was figuring out what to do with that truth once I had it. The medical complex, the restaurant meetings, the prescription medications, the overnight bag. None of it suggested a typical affair, but all of it suggested deception on a scale that went far beyond working late occasionally. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. After Mike left for his job and Emma left for school, I drove back to the medical complex and spent an hour in the lobby, pretending to wait for an appointment while studying the directory of doctors and specialists. The building housed everything from cardiologists to psychiatrists to fertility specialists to addiction counselors. The overnight bag suddenly made more sense. Some of these specialists required preparation for procedures or tests that might necessitate bringing personal items or medications. But why would Mike need to see any of these doctors? And why would he hide it from me? We'd always shared medical information openly, discussing everything from routine physicals to Emma's pediatric appointments. I made a mental note of every doctor's name and specialty, then spent the rest of the morning at home researching each practice online. Most had websites with detailed information about the conditions they treated and the procedures they performed. As I read through descriptions of various medical specialties, a horrible possibility began forming in my mind. What if Mike wasn't having an affair at all? What if he was sick, seriously sick, and hiding his illness from me to protect Emma and our family from worry? The secrecy, the medical appointments, the prescription medications, even the restaurant meetings could be consultations with specialists or support groups for patients dealing with serious diagnoses. The thought that my husband might be battling cancer or heart disease or some other life-threatening condition, while I suspected him of infidelity, made me feel like the worst wife in history. But it also explained why he'd been more attentive lately, why he'd encouraged me to spend time with friends, why he'd been so present with Emma during their homework sessions. He might be trying to create positive memories before delivering devastating news. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I searched Mike's computer. He'd left it open on his desk, logged into his email account, and I told myself I was just checking to see if there were any medical appointments or test results that might confirm my new theory about his behavior. What I found was worse than an affair and more complicated than a medical crisis. Mike's email revealed a correspondence with someone named Alex Chen that went back 6 months. Messages that were too intimate for a business relationship, but too formal for a romantic one. The emails discussed meetings, schedules, progress reports, and something called the program that required regular check-ins and evaluations. There were also emails from various medical professionals, confirming appointments and discussing treatment plans for something called substance dependency recovery. The overnight bag, the Tuesday evening appointments, the secrecy suddenly made terrible sense. Mike wasn't having an affair or hiding a terminal illness. He was hiding an addiction. I sat in Mike's chair, staring at his computer screen, trying to process what I was reading. My husband, the man who barely drank wine with dinner and had never shown any signs of drug use, was apparently in some kind of rehabilitation program. The Alex Chen emails suggested a sponsor or counselor relationship, and the medical appointments were clearly part of an addiction treatment protocol. But addiction to what? Mike's behavior hadn't changed in ways that suggested alcohol or drug abuse. He wasn't missing work, neglecting responsibilities, or showing physical signs of substance abuse. He'd been more reliable lately, not less. More present with Emma, not absent. More concerned about his health and appearance, not deteriorating. The emails provided clues but not complete answers. There were references to quote, behavioral modifications and trigger management and accountability partnerships. One message from Alex mentioned the importance of, quote, maintaining normal family routines while addressing underlying compulsions. Another discussed strategies for disclosure when the client feels ready. The word compulsions stopped me cold. I'd heard it before in the context of gambling addiction, shopping addiction, sex addiction. Behavioral disorders that could destroy families just as effectively as substance abuse, but were harder to detect and treat. Mike could be struggling with something that had nothing to do with drugs or alcohol, but everything to do with behaviors that required secrecy and professional intervention. I spent the next hour reading through months of emails, trying to piece together a timeline and understand the scope of whatever Mike was dealing with. The messages suggested he'd been in treatment for 4 months, attending twice-weekly sessions and working with Alex as some kind of sponsor or accountability partner. There were references to setbacks and breakthroughs, to family impact assessments and disclosure preparation strategies. One email from a Dr. Patricia Williams, dated just 2 weeks ago, made my stomach drop completely. She was discussing Mike's progress in something called intimacy and relationship recovery, and his readiness to begin honest communication with his spouse about his sexual compulsivity disorder and its impact on their marriage. Sexual compulsivity disorder. The words felt like physical blows. My husband wasn't having an affair in the traditional sense, but he was dealing with sexual addiction serious enough to require intensive therapy and medical intervention. The Tuesday evening appointments, the secrecy, the changes in his behavior, all made horrible sense. I thought about the new cologne, the gym membership, the increased attention to his appearance. I thought about his sudden protectiveness of his phone and his encouragement for me to spend time away from home. I thought about our decreased physical intimacy, which I'd attributed to the normal ebb and flow of a long marriage, but which might have been connected to his treatment program. Most importantly, I thought about Emma and how Mike's addiction, whatever its specific manifestations, had been happening in our home, around our daughter, while I remained completely oblivious. The violation felt enormous, not just of our marriage vows, but of my fundamental assumptions about the man I'd chosen to be my child's father. I closed the computer and walked to our bedroom, needing to lie down while I processed what I'd discovered. Our bedroom, with its familiar furniture and family photos, felt like a crime scene where trust had been murdered slowly over months. I looked at our wedding picture on the dresser, two young people who'd promised to love and honor each other through sickness and health, for better or worse. This definitely qualified as worse, but I wasn't sure it qualified as sickness in a way that deserved sympathy rather than anger. Sexual addiction was a real disorder that destroyed real marriages, but it was also a choice to engage in behaviors that violated commitment and trust. Mike had chosen to lie to me for months while seeking help for a problem I didn't even know existed. The most painful realization was that Mike had been making decisions about our marriage without including me in those decisions. He'd decided I couldn't handle the truth about his condition. He'd decided to seek treatment without my support or knowledge. He'd decided to continue our normal routine while secretly working on recovery from an addiction that had apparently been affecting our relationship for longer than he'd been in treatment. I felt angry and betrayed, but I also felt confused about whether my anger was justified. If Mike was sick, if he was getting help, if he was trying to protect our family while addressing his problems, was I wrong to feel deceived? Or was deception exactly the problem, regardless of the underlying reasons? The emails suggested that disclosure to family members was part of the recovery process, something that happened when patients and their treatment teams felt ready. Dr. Williams had recommended that Mike begin preparing for honest communication with me, which meant our current arrangement of lies and secrecy wasn't intended to be permanent. But when would he have told me? And how much would he have shared? That evening, Mike came home from another late work night with flowers and takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. He seemed lighter somehow, less burdened, like someone who'd accomplished something difficult but worthwhile. He helped Emma with her school project, listened to her chatter about playground drama, and tucked her into bed with the patience and attention of a devoted father. Watching him interact with our daughter, I felt a complicated mix of love and fury. This was the Mike I'd fallen in love with and married, the man who could make Emma giggle until her sides hurt, and who remembered every detail of her 8-year-old concerns. But this was also the Mike who'd been lying to me for months about something serious enough to require professional treatment. After Emma was asleep, Mike suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in weeks. He made popcorn and chose a romantic comedy from our list of favorites, settling onto the couch beside me with the kind of intentional closeness that felt like an overture to intimacy. For a moment, I almost forgot what I'd discovered, and let myself enjoy the simple pleasure of sitting with my husband, sharing a bowl of popcorn and laughing at familiar jokes. But then Mike's phone buzzed with a text message, and I saw him check it quickly before placing the phone face down on the coffee table. That small gesture, so automatic and protective, reminded me that nothing about our evening was as simple as it appeared. Mike was performing the role of loving husband while maintaining secrets that could destroy everything we'd built together. When the movie ended, Mike turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I thought he might be preparing to tell me the truth, to begin the honest communication his therapist had recommended. Instead, he kissed my forehead and said he was tired from his long day at work, another small lie in a conversation full of them. That night, I lay awake, planning what I would say when I confronted him. I decided that I couldn't continue living with the knowledge I'd gained while pretending ignorance. Mike deserved the chance to tell me the truth himself, and I deserved the chance to decide how I wanted to respond to that truth. But I also knew that once I revealed what I'd discovered, there would be no going back to our careful pretense of normalcy. Emma would sense the change in our household dynamics, our friends and families would eventually learn about Mike's problems, and our marriage would either survive complete honesty or collapse under the weight of revelations we'd both been avoiding. The next morning, Mike left for work with his usual kiss goodbye and promised to call if he'd be working late. Emma skipped off to school with her backpack and soccer cleats, chattering about an upcoming field trip to the Science Museum. Our morning routine proceeded exactly as it had for years. But I knew it would probably be the last normal morning we'd share as a family that didn't know its own secrets. I called Dr. Patricia Williams' office that afternoon, not to schedule an appointment but to ask questions about sexual compulsivity disorder and its impact on families. The receptionist couldn't provide specific information without patient consent, but she gave me the names of several books and support groups for spouses dealing with similar situations. Reading about sexual addiction felt like studying a foreign language that described behaviors and patterns I should have recognized in my own home. The secrecy, the lying, the compartmentalization of different aspects of life were all common features of addictive disorders. So was the gradual erosion of intimacy between spouses, often masked by periods of increased attention and affection that corresponded with treatment breakthroughs. I learned that sexual addiction affected millions of people and their families, that it was a real disorder with real treatments, and that recovery was possible but required honesty and commitment from everyone involved. I also learned that many marriages didn't survive disclosure, not because the addiction was untreatable, but because the foundation of trust had been too severely damaged by months or years of deception. By Thursday evening, I'd decided exactly what I wanted to say to Mike and when I wanted to say it. I would wait until Emma was asleep, then ask him to sit down for a serious conversation about our marriage. I would tell him I knew about his treatment program and give him the opportunity to explain everything honestly. Then I would decide whether our relationship could survive the truth, or whether I needed to protect myself and Emma by ending our marriage. What I didn't expect was that Mike would beat me to the conversation by exactly one day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.